Hi everyone, this is our third mini lecture for the urinary system. So we're going to wrap up sort of these first couple of objectives by talking about the urinary bladder as well as the process of urination. You may have noticed in the last couple of lectures that there have been some background noises. The way I had to do this today was by recording sitting on the floor of my daughter's bedroom while she has her quiet time and the other one naps. So she would like to say hello to you. And so here she is with a little message.
Hi, my name is Lily.
Is that all you want to say? Okay, so hi, her name is Lily. I'm going to keep recording and hopefully she stays quiet for the next 10 minutes.
I was trying.
Okay, thank you. All right, here we go. Okay, so we're going to get right into the urinary bladder here. So most of you are probably familiar with its general location. I always play this song during class because Lily loves it. Do you remember the bladder song? How does it go?
I forgot, but...
Oh, okay. She claims that she forgets, but she used to run around singing this song. It's called the Bladder Song for Kids. I suggest that you listen to it. It's actually quite anatomically correct, and it'll get stuck in your head. So that is a video that I would normally show. That's what this box is. If you have the PowerPoint, you can. It's embedded in there, so you can watch it from there. Okay. So the bladder is a muscular sac. Again, it sits in the pelvic cavity, so it's pretty far down there. Part of it's protected by the pubic bones, but not all of it. Especially when it's full, it sort of balloons up over those bones, and you can actually sort of physically palpate it or feel it. I'm sure most people are familiar with that feeling of having their bladder pushed on when it's full. That's exactly where the bladder is going to be located. We maintain sort of our three layers here. So we start with our connective tissue. It's either going to be the parietal peritoneum, that's over the top of the bladder. So if we have the bladder that sort of looks like this, over the top of that, sort of this sheet up here, would be the parietal peritoneum. Everywhere else, so sort of around the sides and down towards the urethra, is going to be a fibrous adventitia, which is sort of what we saw in connection to the ureters. The muscle in the urinary bladder is actually called the detrusor muscle. This muscle is going to be 3 layers of smooth muscle. Oops, hold on, I don't want that to be yellow. So this would be 3 layers, and again, smooth muscles, so we do not control contractions of the bladder. And then we do have a mucosa. The mucosal here again is our urothelium or uroepithelium or transitional epithelium. You can pick one of those. They'll all give you the same results. Sort of the key characteristics here are that we have umbrella shells on the cells, not shells. Umbrella cells on the surface. Those are going to help protect us from that really hypertonic and acidic urine. So these are for protection. Whoops. No, don't play. Okay. We also, in this mucosa, are going to have what are called rugae. We saw rugae when we were looking at the digestive system and looking at the stomach. The similarity here between the urinary bladder and the stomach is that both of these are sort of hollow organs that are intended to be filled. So when we fill them, the rugae allow for that distension. They, when it's empty, it forms a sort of these wrinkles, and then as they flatten out, we get more volume that we can actually hold in terms of the urine that's present. The last thing I'll mention about sort of the combination of the umbrella cells and the rugae is that when the bladder is empty and we look at the mucosal layer, it's going to be 5 to 6 cells thick. Okay, so we have lots of cells sort of stacked up on top of each other. When the bladder is when the bladder is full, we get stretching out of those rugae and the umbrella cells. The urothelium sort of also stretches out. Then we only have 2 to 3 cells. So I'm going to write that down here. We have 5 to 6 cells thick when empty, and only 2 to 3 cells thick. Jeez, I'm sorry, I don't know why it's doing that so much, when the bladder is full. And so that's that mucosa spreads out. We get the rugae spreading out. We get the urothelium spreading out. The combination of those two things reduces the layers of cells that we have there. So I have some pictures on the next slide. I'll point out the trigon when we're there. Overall, our bladder has a capacity of about 800 milliliters, so just under a liter. That would feel pretty full. I think most people are probably a little bit more comfortable with a capacity less than that. It is highly distensible, and as the rugae flatten, we get that epithelium thinning. All of those things are going to help us with the capacity and being able to fill the bladder. So here's a look at the urinary bladder. We can sort of just review the things I talked about on the last slide. So here's that peritoneum, right, just covering the superior surface. Everything else is going to be covered by a different type of connective tissue. Most of the wall of the bladder is going to be made up of that detrusor muscle. The interior is going to have our transitional epithelium, which we can see here. We can also see the nice rugae, so these nice waves or wrinkles or folds in that mucosal layer. When this bladder fills up, those will stretch out and this will be flattened. Okay, and we'll also see a change in the number of cells that we have here. Some of these you can see really nicely, like over here, these are going to be those umbrella cells. Those are going to help protect everything underneath, so everything in the wall of this bladder from the damage that could potentially be caused by the urine. The trigon that I was talking about is on sort of the base of the bladder floor. It is 3 openings in the shape of a triangle. We have our 2 ureter openings, and then we have the opening of the urethra. So here's one ureter and here's the other ureter. Those are going to pass posterior and then inferior, and again, actually come up underneath and enter the bladder from sort of the bottom. And then here's the urethra, which would be our 3rd opening. So we can see that they form a triangle, which is why we call that the trigon. We can also see here's the internal urethral sphincter, so right at the very base where the urethra opens from the urinary bladder is our smooth muscle sphincter. Down here, this is as the urethra travels through the pelvic wall, we get the external urethral sphincter. This one is our skeletal muscle, so smooth muscle, skeletal muscle. When we talked about the digestive system, we talked about gallstones, and so I thought it was maybe appropriate that we also talk about kidney stones at this point. Kidney stones, just like with the digestive system, the purpose of that particular part of the system is waste removal and storage. Anytime we get waste pulled out, what we're likely to get is some sort of calcium waste. When that calcium waste sits around, it can sometimes react with other things that are in the waste and cause these really hard stones, right? So a lot of people get kidney stones. They can be very painful. Here's a radiology image of a kidney stone. This one's huge. You can see it fills up like most of that kidney. Here's one that's filled up pretty much all of the open space in a kidney. Lots of causes. One of the main things they'll tell you if you get a kidney stone is drink more water. Make sure that you're not eating so much calcium. Your pHs need to be imbalanced. They can also be caused by an infection or sort of retention of urine in the bladder, rather in the kidneys where we wouldn't want them. There are a number of ways to treat this. So there are drugs that help dissolve them. Sometimes they do ultrasound if they're small enough, which will break them into small pieces. If they're small enough, you sort of hope they just pass. But you can see that something like this, which is in a kidney, is certainly not going to fit down that ureter or through the urinary bladder and out the urethra. That's why they're so painful, is they're pretty big and they're being pushed through sort of these small little tubes. All right, so moving out into the urethra, we are going to look at a male and a female urethra. We're starting with the female urethra here. So I'm going to orient us on this image. So here's the spinal cord. Here is the rectum and the anus. Here is the uterus, the vaginal canal, and then this is going to be the pubic bone. So shown here in a nice pinkish peachy color is going to be the urinary bladder. This opening is the urethra. So the urethra in the female runs from the base of the urinary bladder to the exterior of the body. Fairly short in females, so only 3 to 4 centimeters in length. It is closely associated with the vaginal wall, so they sort of share this wall in here. That's the vagina, and this is the urethra, so they do share that sort of space there. And then we'd have the internal urethral sphincter here, and then the external urethral sphincter here. When we're looking at the two sphincters, we'll see that they are similar in males and females, although further apart in the two. In a female, the internal urethral sphincter is caused by a thickening of the detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of the bladder, and that's our smooth muscle, so involuntarily controlled. And then the external urethral sphincter as we pass through muscles of the pelvic floor. All right, so let's take a look at the male urethra. Same situation here. I can orient us. This is our spinal column. Here is the rectum and the anus. Here is the pubic bone. This is the penis, the testes, and this is the urinary bladder. So these are the ureters coming in the top, passing over, actually entering from the inferior side. And here, this whole peachy tube is going to be the urethra. So the first thing you should notice is that the urethra in the male is much longer than the urethra in the female. It is about 18 centimeters in length. It has 3 regions, and they are not written on here. So the 3 regions of the male urethra are going to be the prosthetic urethra, we then have the membranous urethra, and finally, we would have the spongy region. Whoops. Sorry about that. The prosthetic urethra is going to be about 2.5 centimeters. It's this first region right in here where it actually runs through the prostate. That's why it's called prosthetic. The membranous urethra is very short. It's just inferior to that, and so that would be about half a centimeter. And then the entire length of the urethra in the male that runs through the penis is called the spongy urethra. So that would be the remaining sort of 15 centimeters. Again, we have internal and external urethral sphincters, and those are going to be composed of similar fashion to what we see in the female. So smooth muscle in the internal and skeletal muscle in the external. Just looking at a side-by-side comparison of the two, again, major difference is length. Males, much longer urethra than what we see in females. We also do have differences in the length between our internal and our external sphincters. So males all the way through the prostate before we hit the external sphincter. Females, just very short little piece in there. The overall structure of the urethra between males and females is actually going to tell us a little bit about why females are so much more susceptible to urinary tract infections. A bacteria that is living sort of right out here outside of the female's urethra doesn't have to go very far to get from here to here. Right, so just a very short trip. It's a nice sort of warm, moist environment, and so bacteria can grow pretty easily. If a male has a bacteria living outside of their urethra, they're going to have to travel much further to get into the bladder and cause any real damage. So females are just more likely to get urinary tract infections because the urethras are much more accessible and shorter for bacteria and pathogens to enter. All right, and our very last thing for this particular mini lecture is urination. We do actually have a fairly similar process for urination that we do with defecation. The first thing that's going to happen that's going to start this process is the bladder is going to fill. As it fills, it is going to actually relax the detrusor muscle. So the detrusor muscle must be relaxed in order for the bladder to fill up. At this point, while it's filling, those sphincters are closed, both internal and external. Once the bladder reaches a particular level of fullness, we begin to sense it, and there are stretch receptors that are going to carry messages to the spinal cord, and that is going to cause sort of this pulsating, relax, and contract of the detrusor muscle, and that's when we start feeling urgency. Okay, so it fills, and then we get messages that go to the spinal cord that cause the detrusor muscle to relax and contract. When it relaxes and contracts, we're starting to get, again, that feeling of like we probably need to go to the bathroom. And then after that, we get our motor fibers from, again, the spinal cord, which are going to help open that external sphincter. So once the detrusor muscle starts to do its pulsating, the internal sphincter is going to open. That gives us a real feeling of urgency, and then we are going to go to the bathroom so that we can open that external sphincter. And here's the whole process just shown a little bit differently so that we can see what's going on here. Okay, so here we're starting with number 1. Number 1 is part of the involuntary reflex, and I should also point out that this is called micturition. So micturition is going to be the process of urination. So the first step in the involuntary micturition reflex is going to be those stretch receptors, which are shown here as these green pieces of these nerves, these sensory fibers. They are going to detect that the bladder is filling, and they are going to send that message to the spinal cord. The signal then returns to the bladder. So in the spinal cord, it gets integrated, and then we have these efferent fibers, which are going to go back to the bladder. That is going to excite the detrusor muscle, so the detrusor muscle is going to start contracting, right? It is also going to signal to the internal urethral sphincter to open. So we get message 1 going into the spinal cord, it integrates, that message or that reflex comes back very quickly from the spinal cord to 3 and 4, which is going to be excitation of the detrusor muscle and excitation of the internal urethral sphincter. The other thing that happens is as the bladder fills, we get that message sent to the brain, right? So to the pons and cerebellum. We get information back from both of those locations. They are going to enhance these actions that we see, so enhance contraction and enhance opening of that sphincter. They are also, from the cerebral cortex, this is our conscious awareness. We get that information sent to the external urethral sphincter, and we make the decision to open that and release the urine. So this is the overall process of micturition. All right, and so that's it. This lecture is a little bit long, so hopefully I'll be able to make the next couple a little bit shorter, but we are finished with our first couple of objectives here, and I will be back to talk to you about kidneys in the next couple.